dog had been pressing her nose to the northwest corner of the yard for 19 mornings, before Hannah Reaves stopped pretending she did not see it. She was a black and tan collie, 8 years old, narrow through the chest, with one ear that stood up and one that did not, and her name was Juno. She had come west in a crate with the rest of what a widow could carry, and she had never been a dog much given to invention. She did not chase wagons. She did not bark at strangers unless the strangers carried a weapon. She slept where she was put and ate what she was given. So when she walked the same arc of frozen ground for 19 mornings in a row, head low, ribs lifting and falling in the cold air, ears flattened in a way Hannah had only seen once before in her life, Hannah took down the almanac from the shelf above the stove and circled the date in pencil. It was the 11th of October, in the year 1886, on the high grass country northwest of Pine Bluff, in the Nebraska Territory, and the dog was telling her something the calendar did not yet know. Hannah Reaves was 34 years old that autumn. She had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Samuel, had been a quiet man who built a one-room sod house with his own hands in the summer of '83 and died of a kicked-in chest the spring of '85, leaving her 160 acres of grass, a milk cow, 6 laying hens, 2 horses she could barely feed, and the dog. The town of Pine Bluff lay 4 miles south of her claim, and the town of Pine Bluff had decided, in the slow and casual way towns decide such things, that a widow alone on a claim was a problem to be either married off or moved off, and that it would not extend itself to help her be anything else. She did not blame them. She did not engage them. She kept her hens, sold her butter to the only man who would still buy it, and watched her dog. The first time the women at the well had laughed at her was in August. She had walked the 4 miles for nails and lamp oil and a paper of needles, and she had stopped at the well to water Juno before the walk home. And the wife of the blacksmith had said, in a voice meant to be heard, that the widow Reaves had taken to consulting her dog about the weather, and that next year she would be consulting the chickens about the price of wheat. The laughter that followed was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was the laughter of people who had already decided a person did not require their consideration. Hannah had drawn the bucket, watered the dog, tipped her hat to the women without quite looking at them, and walked the 4 miles home with the nails in her apron and the needles in her sleeve. She did not cry until she was inside her own door. She cried for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she went out to the yard and watched Juno. The dog was digging, not frantically, methodically. She was scraping at a patch of hillside on the lee side of the rise behind the soddy, the side that faced northwest, and she was scraping in a tight half-moon pattern, as if marking an outline. Hannah stood at the corner of the house, with her arms crossed, and watched for the better part of an hour. When Juno finished, she walked 20 feet to the southeast and lay down in a sun-warmed hollow and slept. Hannah went to the patch the dog had marked and knelt down and put her hand flat against the ground. The ground was warmer there than it had any business being, not by much, by the breadth of a thought, but warmer. She did not know yet what to do with that information. She put it in the pocket of her mind, where she kept the things Samuel had once said and not explained, and she went back to her churn. The second mocker came in September, and his name was Reverend Olcott. He rode up to her gate one afternoon on a sorrel mare and did not dismount, which was its own kind of message. He said he had been thinking of her in his prayers and had been moved to come and speak plain. He said a woman alone was a temptation to her own thinking, and that thinking unchecked by the company of sound men could carry a soul to strange places. He said it had been brought to his attention that she was building something. He did not say by whom. He said the building of an unusual thing in an unusual way invited the unusual notice of Providence, and not always the kind of notice a Christian woman should seek. He said all of this without unkindness. He said it the way a man reads from a ledger. Then he tipped his hat and rode back the 4 miles to town, and Hannah stood at her gate and watched him go and felt, for the first time since Samuel had died, the particular cold that comes from being seen and dismissed in the same breath. She did not answer the Reverend. She turned around and looked at the dog. The dog was lying with her chin on her paws, watching the northwest horizon. The horizon was empty. The sky was the soft milk blue of a good September afternoon. There was nothing there to see. The dog watched it anyway. That was the day Hannah began to build in earnest. She had been laying sod since the first week of August. Samuel had taught her how to cut it 3 years before he died. In the summer they broke the prairie together. He had shown her the special plow, the cutter blade set at an angle, the way to drive the team slow and steady, so the ribbon of turf came up unbroken and 3 inches thick, and the right width for a wall. He had laid the original soddy on the standard pattern of the country, walls 2 feet thick, grass side down, every third course turned the other way, lintels of cottonwood over the door and the one small window. 2 feet was what the book said. 2 feet was what the neighbors had. 2 feet was enough for an ordinary winter on the high grass. Hannah had stripped her cellar in the 3rd week of August and begun to lay a second wall around the first. Not against it. Around it. With a space of 18 inches between the original wall and the new one, and that 18 inches packed with a mixture she had spent 2 weeks gathering. Dry buffalo grass, the chaff swept from the threshing floor of the only neighbor who would still rent her his oxen, the inner husks of corn from her own small patch, and the dry pithy stems of last year's sunflowers, broken short and packed in tight. She had laid the second wall 2 feet thick as well, sod on sod, grass side down, every third course turned. By the time the Reverend Olcott rode up to her gate, the walls of the Reeves soddy were 4 feet through, with a layer of trapped dead air and dry plant matter running between 2 solid courses of prairie, and the roof was already underway, a double layer with the same trapped middle, joists doubled, sod on top 3 deep instead of the usual 2. She did not know the words for what she was doing. She had not read them in a book. She had read them in the dog. She had begun by noticing where Juno chose to sleep, and where she did not. The dog avoided the corner of the yard where the wind came off the long flat to the northwest. She would not lie there even in the heat of August, when the breeze should have been a comfort. She preferred the hollow on the southeast lee of the rise, where the ground stayed warmer at night, and she would scratch a shallow bed in the dust and curve her body around itself, and sleep with her nose tucked under her tail. Hannah had watched her do this for 2 years before Samuel died. She had not paid much attention. Now she paid attention to nothing else. She watched the dog circle, and dig, and refuse certain places, and choose others, and she began to understand that the dog was reading the landscape with senses Hannah did not have, and that what the dog read was the truth of the ground beneath their feet. The lee of the rise was warmer, because the wind had been polishing it cold for 1,000 years on the other side, driving the cold into the hill and leaving the southeast face untouched. The corner of the yard the dog avoided was the corner the wind would find first. The patch the dog had marked in August, the warm patch, was where the earth itself was venting the day's heat back into the night. And Hannah had walked that patch with her hand at her knees and felt the seam of warmth and understood, in a flash that was nearly embarrassing, that her old husband's well had been sunk on the wrong side of the rise. The dog had been telling her for 2 years where the water sat under the ground. She had not been listening. She listened now. She moved her stored water barrels to the warm patch and banked them with sod. She set her root cellar door on the southeast face. She built the new outer wall of the soddy, so that the corner the dog avoided was the corner with the least surface area to the wind, and the wall on that side she laid 5 feet thick instead of 4, and she dug the dirt for those extra sod bricks from the patch of ground the dog had marked as cold, so that the very earth that would have bled heat from her house in January became the wall that kept the heat in. The 3rd week of September, a man named Cyril Vance rode out from town to look. Cyril Vance was the second mocker, though Hannah did not yet have a word for him. He was the man who bought her butter. He was not unkind. He was a small, wiry man with a permanent squint and the kind of practical mind that found anything it did not immediately understand to be a personal affront. He sat his horse at her gate and looked at the soddy for a long time. Then he said, slow and flat, that he had heard tell she was stacking sod 4 feet thick, and that he had not believed it, and that now he had seen it he believed it, but he wished he did not. He said a soddy was a soddy. He said 2 feet had kept his own father warm through the winter of '73, which had been the worst winter in living memory, and that anything more than 2 feet was a woman making work for herself because she had no man to tell her when to stop. He said it with a kind of pity that was harder to bear than the Reverend's dismissal, because the pity assumed she did not know she was a fool, and was trying to spare her the knowledge. Hannah did not argue. She gave him the week's butter wrapped in clean cloth. She took his coins. She watched him ride away. The dog walked to the gate and watched him too, and then turned and walked, with the deliberate gait of an animal that has work to do, back to the northwest corner of the yard, where she put her nose to the ground and stood for a long time without moving. That night the dog lay down across the threshold of the soddy door, instead of in her usual place beside the stove. She had not done that since the spring Samuel died. Hannah stepped over her 3 times before she understood that the dog had no intention of moving, and then she sat down on the floor beside her and put a hand on the rough fur of her neck and watched the door with the dog for a long time before she went to bed. In the morning, Hannah took down the almanac again and counted forward from the 11th of October and made a mark beside the 15th of January, which was the date the almanac predicted as the deepest cold of the winter. Then she crossed it out. She did not know why she crossed it out. She set the book back on the shelf and went to finish the roof. The forgotten wisdom she was working from, she would not find in writing until many years later. In the back pages of a trapper's journal, her son brought home from a trading post in Wyoming, where a man named Auguste Brassard had written in a careful slanted hand that the dogs of the high country always knew the bad winters 3 weeks before the men did, and that, what the dogs knew, they read from the ground itself, from the smell of the deep frost coming, from the silence of certain burrowing creatures that should have still been about their business in autumn, from the way the air moved over rises and did not move over hollows. Brassard had written that an Oglala woman of his acquaintance had taught him to mark where the dogs would not lie and to build away from those places, and that the dogs had once kept her people alive through a winter that had taken 3 white settlements in a single week. Hannah did not have Brassard's journal that autumn. She had only Juno, and Juno was enough. By the 1st of November the soddy was finished. 4-foot walls all around, 5 foot on the northwest, the roof double-built with chaff and grass packed between, a banked earth berm around the base of the house to the height of the window-sills. The chimney rebuilt with a draft baffle Hannah had worked out by watching the way Juno slept near the stove and where the smoke pooled when the wind came certain ways. The door faced southeast on the lee of the rise, and a small windbreak of sod and brush stood between the door and the prairie. The well was moved. The cellar was banked. The hens were in a half-buried coop against the south wall of the house. The cow was in a stall built into the lee bank itself, with sod walls and a sod roof, and the 2 horses had a similar shelter cut into the rise beside her. Hannah had moved the woodpile 3 times before settling it where the dog walked when she came in from her morning circle, on the theory that the dog would not walk through a place that held bad weather. The town of Pine Bluff, in the same season, had done what towns do. They had banked their houses with a foot of straw. They had laid in their usual cordwood. They had brought in their hay. They had not built differently. They had no reason to. The almanac said an ordinary winter. The old men said an ordinary winter. The dogs of Pine Bluff slept where they had always slept, but no one in Pine Bluff was watching the dogs of Pine Bluff. The first snow came on the 12th of November, light and dry and ordinary, and it melted by the 14th. The second came on the 20th and stayed. The third came on the 28th, and by the 1st of December there was 8 inches of snow on the level, and the temperature at dawn stood at 4 degrees below zero, and the people of Pine Bluff said the winter was coming on hard but not unusual, and they settled into it. Hannah did not settle. She watched the dog. On the 3rd of January, in the late afternoon, Juno did something she had never done in 8 years of life. She came into the house through the door Hannah had cracked open to throw out a basin of wash water, and she walked directly to the iron stove, and she lay down with her body pressed against the warm iron, and she would not be coaxed away from it. She did not whine. She did not pant. She lay flat against the stove with her eyes half closed, and her ribs lifting slow and shallow, and she stayed there. Hannah stood in the middle of the room and watched the dog and felt the cold come up through the soles of her boots. From the floor she had laid herself, and she went to the window and looked out at the prairie. The prairie looked exactly as it had looked the day before. Hannah went to the door and opened it and stepped out and put her face into the wind. The wind was from the northwest. It was not strong. The sky was the pale gray of an ordinary January. There was nothing in the air she could name. She came back inside. She closed the door. She drew the heavy quilt she had sewn for that purpose across the inside of the door, and tucked it under the bottom and weighted it with the long sandbag she had made from the leg of an old pair of Samuel's trousers. She drew the second quilt across the window. She brought in the day's water from the cistern she had banked in the lee of the rise. She brought in 2 extra armloads of firewood. She brought the hens, one by one, into a crate inside the house, because she did not trust the coop in what was coming. She brought Juno's water bowl and set it beside the stove. Though Juno had not lifted her head from the iron, by the time she had finished it was full dark, and the wind had risen. The blizzard of January '87, which would later be called by various names in various places, but which the men who survived it on the high grass would call only the Great Storm, with no further qualification, began that night a little after 8 o'clock in the evening, with a sound Hannah had never heard before in 14 winters on the plains. It was not the wind, though the wind came. It was a low, almost musical thrumming that came up through the floor and the walls together, as if the ground itself were a great drum being struck somewhere far underneath. Juno raised her head from the stove for the first time in 3 hours and looked at the door. Then she lowered her head again. The thrumming went on for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Then the wind hit the northwest corner of the soddy. It hit hard enough that Hannah, sitting in the chair beside the stove with her hands folded in her lap, because there was nothing left to do, felt the chair move beneath her. She felt the 4-foot wall move. She felt it move, and then she felt it not move, and she understood, in the same flash she had understood about the well, that the wall had taken the blow and held, and that the 18 inches of trapped dead air and chaff and grass and corn husk between the inner and outer courses had absorbed what the outer course alone could not have absorbed, and that the wall had bent without breaking the way a green branch bends in a gale. She put her hand on the inner wall. It was warm. It was warm the way a living thing is warm. She left her hand there for a long time. The wind did not stop. The wind became the world. The wind blew at a pitch and a force she had no comparison for, and the sound of it was the sound of every loose thing on the prairie being scoured into the air and carried east. She heard her woodpile go, not the woodpile by the door, which she had banked, but the smaller pile of kindling she had left near the cow shelter. She heard it go in a single rattle and then heard nothing more of it. She heard once a sound that might have been a coyote crying somewhere in the storm, but she could not be certain it was not a man. She listened for that sound for a long time. She did not hear it again. The temperature, which she could not measure because she had no glass for that purpose, would later be reported in the territorial papers as 40 degrees below zero, with the wind making it something no instrument could properly say. The storm would blow for 3 days and 2 nights without lull. It would bury Pine Bluff under 14 feet of drift on its windward side and scour it bare on its lee side, so that some houses were buried to their chimneys, and others stood with their north walls scoured down to the bare sod brick, and the church steeple, which had been the tallest thing in the county, would be sheared off at the joist line and carried somewhere onto the open prairie and never found. But Hannah did not know any of that yet. She knew only that the wind was outside, and the wall was holding, and the dog was breathing slow against the stove, and the fire was steady, and the hens were quiet in their crate, and the cow, in her sod stall built into the lee bank, was warm enough that Hannah could hear her chewing. On the morning of the second day, Juno got up from the stove for the first time, and walked to the door and stood beside it. She did not scratch. She did not bark. She stood. Hannah went to the door and put her ear against the heavy quilt, and listened. The wind was still high, but there was a thinness to it now, an upper register that suggested it had less to throw. She did not open the door. She watched the dog. The dog stood by the door for perhaps 10 minutes, and then she turned and walked back to the stove and lay down. Hannah did not understand what the dog had been listening for. She would understand later. On the afternoon of the second day, she heard something through the wall. She had been heating water for tea, the small luxury of the storm, and she had just set the kettle back on the stove when she heard, faint but distinct, a single high cry from somewhere outside the northwest wall. She froze with her hand on the kettle handle. The cry came again. It was thinner the second time. It was the cry of a child, and it was not close, and it was on the wrong side of the storm. She looked at Juno. Juno had raised her head. She was looking at the door, but she was not getting up. She was watching, with her one ear up and her one ear down, and she was not getting up. Hannah did not understand at first why the dog was not getting up. The dog had been the one to lead her in this whole winter. The dog had read the ground for her. The dog had told her where to build and where not to build, and when to bring the hens inside. If a child was crying outside, the dog should be at the door. The dog was not at the door. Hannah went to the door anyway. She put her hand on the latch. She heard the wind. She heard, beneath the wind, the second cry. She put her shoulder to the door to lift the bar. Juno made a sound then, not a bark, a low sound in her throat, almost a hum. The same sound she had made on the 3rd of October in the yard, when Hannah had first stepped onto the warm patch by mistake. Hannah turned around. The dog was looking at her. The dog was looking at her with the patient, finished look of an animal that has done its part and is waiting to see whether the human will do hers. Hannah understood, then, what the dog had been telling her by not getting up. The dog had been telling her that whoever was outside could not be reached, that to open the door now, in that wind, would be to lose the door, and to lose the door would be to lose the house, and to lose the house would be to lose the hens and the cow, and the horses and Juno and herself, and the child would die anyway, because the child was already in the storm, and the storm would not give the child back to anyone who walked into it. The dog was telling her that her work in this storm was to keep the door shut. Hannah took her hand off the latch. She stood with her forehead against the door for a long time. The wind was the wind. The cry, when it came a third time, was further away, as if whoever made it had been moved by the wind itself, and then it did not come again. Hannah walked back to the stove and sat down in the chair and put her face in her hands, and did not weep, because to weep would have used water her body could not spare. She breathed. She breathed for a long time. Juno walked over and put her head on Hannah's knee, and Hannah put her hand on the dog's head and left it there until the fire needed feeding. That was the worst hour of the storm. Hannah would not speak of it for the rest of her life. She would carry it as a widow carries the second loss, the one that comes after the first and is harder because it cannot be named. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. It did not break the way storms and stories break, with a sudden silence and a clean blue sky. It broke the way real storms break, by degrees, with the wind dropping a notch and then dropping another, and then a long sullen afternoon of high gray cloud and blowing surface snow and the suggestion, more than the fact, of stillness. Hannah did not open the door on the 4th day. She did not open it on the 5th, though Juno went to it twice and stood and came back. On the 6th, Juno stood at the door and did not come back. She stood with her tail low and her ears forward, and she looked at Hannah, and Hannah understood she was being told it was time. Hannah unbarred the door. The light, when it came in, was the strange flat light of a world rearranged. Her yard was not her yard. The drifts had come up to the eaves of the soddy on the northwest side and dropped sheer away on the southeast, so that the door opened into a small bright pocket of clear ground, as if the wind had carved a courtyard for her use. The windbreak she had built of sod and brush stood half buried. The cow shelter was a low white hump in the bank. The hen coop, which she had emptied in time, was gone, not damaged. Gone. The woodpile by the door was intact. The cistern was banked under 3 feet of snow, but the pump handle stood clear, and the pump, when she tried it later, drew water. Juno walked out into the carved courtyard and stood and put her nose into the air for a long time. Then she walked, with the same deliberate gait Hannah had seen 100 times, to the northwest corner of the yard, the corner she had avoided for 2 years, and she stood there. She did not dig. She did not circle. She stood. Then she walked back to the door and waited for Hannah to follow her. Hannah took her cloak from the peg, and her good boots, and a small bundle of bread and salt pork, because the dog was telling her they were going somewhere, and Hannah had learned that year to do what the dog told her. They went south. The 4 miles to Pine Bluff took most of the day. The drifts ran in long curving ridges where the wind had laid them, and Juno went over the ridges with the lightness of a creature half her age, and Hannah went after her with the heavy plodding of a woman in skirts in deep snow, but they went. The sun was a thin, pale disk behind high cloud. The temperature was a kind of cold that bit at the bones beneath the skin. They saw no living thing on the 4 miles. They saw twice dark shapes that Hannah did not let herself look at closely. Pine Bluff, when they came over the last rise, was not there. That is the only honest way to put it. The town she had walked to 100 times, the row of false front buildings along the main street, the steeple of the church, the smithy with its slate roof, the general store with its painted sign, was not what she saw. What she saw was a long broken curve of snowdrifts with darker things showing through them at intervals. A chimney, a piece of a wall, a wagon tongue. The bell of the church, half buried, lying at an angle in a hollow where the steeple had been. The houses on the north side of the street were buried to their roof lines. The houses on the south side were buried to their windows. 2 houses she could not find at all. She stood on the rise for a long time before she went down. Juno went down ahead of her. The dog moved through the wreckage of the town the way she moved through the yard at home, deliberate, head low, reading the ground. She led Hannah to the buried doorway of the blacksmith's house, where the wife who had laughed at the well was still alive, with her 2 small children and her elderly mother, all of them huddled in the kitchen with the last of their coal burned through, and a chair already broken up for the stove. She led her to the back room of the general store, where Cyril Vance had ridden out the storm with his wife and his clerk, and a barrel of crackers and 1 frozen foot that he would later lose to the knee. She led her to the parsonage, where Reverend Olcott was still alive, but barely, because he had given his coat and his blanket and most of his coal to the family that had taken shelter with him when their own roof went. She led her, in the end, to a small dugout on the east edge of town, where a woman named Mary Sturgis lived alone with her infant son, and where Mary Sturgis was sitting upright in a cold chair holding the child against her chest, and the child was alive because the mother was alive, and the mother was alive because she had laid down on the floor against the warm earth wall and pulled every quilt she owned over both of them and breathed slow. Hannah did not say "I told you so" to any of them. She had nothing to tell. She had a 4-foot wall and a dog and a stove that still burned, and she had 4 miles of broken country between Pine Bluff and that stove, and she did what the storm required. She brought them home, not all in one day. It took 3 days, and she made the trip with the cow harnessed to a sledge she built from her own door frame and a piece of the cow stall roof. And Juno went with her every trip and led her, every trip, around the soft places in the drifts where a sledge would have foundered. She brought the blacksmith's wife and her children, and her mother first, because the blacksmith's wife had small children. She brought Mary Sturgis and the infant on the second trip. She brought Cyril Vance and his wife on the third, and his clerk, and a young man named Peter Hollis, who had survived in the loft of the smithy and could not walk on his frostbitten feet. She brought Reverend Olcott last, because he insisted on being last, and because by the time she came back for him on the 4th day, a small relief party from the railroad line at Bender's Junction had come up the rail bed on snowshoes, and they took him east to a doctor. The soddy, when full, held 11 people, 3 children, a dog, a cow, 2 horses, 4 laying hens, and a fire that did not go out. The walls were warm. The chaff between the courses had done what chaff between courses does. The door on the southeast lee opened and closed without the wind ever finding it. They ate her root cellar nearly empty in 2 weeks. They slept on every flat surface. The blacksmith's wife, on the 3rd night, sat down beside Hannah at the stove and put a hand on her wrist and started to say something, and Hannah shook her head once, and the woman did not finish, and that was the end of what was said between them about the well in August. Cyril Vance, on the 5th night, sat at her table with his bandaged foot up on a chair and watched her ladle stew, and he said, in his slow, flat way, that he had been wrong about the 4 feet. He did not say more than that. He did not need to. Hannah nodded once and gave him his bowl. The Reverend, before the railmen took him east, sat in her chair beside her stove and looked at Juno for a long time and said only that the Lord moved in ways that did not always require a pulpit to be understood. Hannah did not reply. She did not need to. The spring came late that year, and slow. The bodies the storm had taken were not all found until April, and some not until the next winter, and one not at all. The town of Pine Bluff was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt different. The man who rebuilt the general store laid his walls 1.5 feet thick of sod inside the frame, and he packed the space between with chaff, and he did not tell anyone he was doing it, and no one asked. The blacksmith's wife, who never again laughed at a well, sent her oldest girl out to the Reaves claim every Saturday for 2 years to help Hannah with the washing. And the girl grew up to marry a man named Hollis, the same Peter Hollis who had survived in the smithy loft, and they took a claim of their own 10 miles north, and they built it. When they built it, 4 feet thick on the northwest wall, Hannah did not marry again. She kept her 160 acres. She kept her cow, and she got more hens. And the next spring she got a second dog, a half-grown pup the railroad men had left at the depot. And she trained the pup by walking it in circles around the yard behind Juno, who taught it where to lie and where not to lie without ever being asked. Juno lived 4 more years and died in her sleep in the warm hollow on the southeast lee of the rise on a bright morning in May, and Hannah dug her grave on the warm patch by the cistern where the ground was easy to break, and she did not mark it, because she did not need a mark to find it. She visited it every spring for 31 years, until she could no longer walk so far. And after that she sat at her window and looked at the corner of the yard where the second dog, and then the third, lay sleeping in the same hollow, and she nodded to them the way a woman nods to old friends across a room. She lived to be 81 years old. She died in the same soddy, with the same 4-foot walls, in the winter of 1933, and the walls were still warm when the neighbors came to find her. When her grandson cleaned out the soddy that spring, he found, tucked behind the almanac on the shelf above the stove, a single sheet of paper in his grandmother's careful hand, dated October 11th, 1886. That's only this. The dog has been digging at the same patch of hillside for 19 mornings. I do not yet know what she is telling me. I have decided to believe her. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, and he kept it the rest of his life, and he passed it to his own daughter, and somewhere in a drawer in a farmhouse in eastern Nebraska it is, perhaps, there still. On the frontier, wisdom sometimes walked on 4 legs and asked nothing in return except to be believed. If this story stayed with you, there is another waiting by the same fire.